Hello, everyone. My name's Jennifer Deneen, and I'm an associate professor in residence in the School of Public Policy at the University of Connecticut. I'm also the associate director of the Yukon Arms Center. Welcome to the third panel of our four-part series entitled Bearing the Burden. This series is co-sponsored by the Yukon Arms Center and the Taubman Center at Brown University. Today's panel is being recorded and live streamed, and it will be reposted on social media as well as other outlets. My co-organizers for this event are Carrie Raytheon of the University of Connecticut, Wendy Schiller of Brown University, and Caitlin Sidorsky of Coastal Carolina University. Our thanks to Haley Troy, Josh Harden, Michaela Carey, and Melanie Sklonik for all they did to make this webinar happen today. Our four-part series focuses on gun violence in America, its intersection with domestic violence, and its disproportionate impact on women, especially women of color. The impetus for this series is to bring together the community of scholars who are focusing on these crucial issues across multiple academic areas. In our first webinar, we learned about how women are more likely to bear the burden of gun violence in the United States as victims, due to rising rates of women's suicide, and in carrying the grief and trauma resulting from gun violence. In our second webinar, legislators and scholars discussed the creation of firearm laws to understand how state and federal governments create firearm policy. The links to view both of these webinars, as well as this webinar in the future, have been made available in the chat. Today's speakers are Dr. Carolyn West of the University of Washington, Dr. Noelle St. Bill of the University of Buffalo School of Social Work, Professor Liz Tobin Tyler of Brown University, and attorney Tashun Bowden Lewis, the Chief Public Defender of the state of Connecticut. We are so grateful to have each of you with us today for this important conversation. So all of you in the audience know how this webinar will work. Each of our panelists will speak for about 10 minutes about their area of expertise and their current work. After all four panelists have had a chance to share with us, we will open up the question period. I'll get us started with a question or two, but you can all feel free to put your questions in the chat or raise your hand, and when we can recognize you, you can unmute and ask the question yourself. Either is fine. I will look at the chat when the Q&A starts, and I will let you all know that that's happening. Today, we're going to be discussing the phenomenon that women of color are more likely to be victims of domestic violence in the United States. The unequal treatment women of color receive from our justice system due to the higher likelihood of dual arrests and incarceration for self-defense in domestic violence situations. We'll also talk about the challenges posed by recent court decisions and the increasingly permissive firearm context they create. Finally, we will explore that Black women are more likely to bear the burden of losing a loved one to gun violence, as well as the rise in Black female gun ownership in the United States. Dr. Carolyn West is going to get us started. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Dr. West, you are welcome to start sharing yours.
Okay, thank you so much for having me. I think this is an important conversation, and I am very excited to have it with participants. I'm at the University of Washington, and I'm a clinical psychologist by training. You know, every day I typically watch the news in some form or another, and I read the New York Times. And I think many of us are very alarmed by the numbers of mass shootings that seem to be happening on an almost daily basis. What happened in Alabama recently? What happened in Louisville, at the bank at Nashville? So mass shootings seem to be happening every day, and it is very disconcerting for most of us. And what's even more concerning is that we seem to be on pace to actually have even more mass shootings. Uh, and the pace of these mass shootings just seems to be accelerating to the point of probably on average every 6 to 7 days in this country. So more of us are aware of these mass shootings and gun violence in general. However, I think that there's a part of the conversation that we seem to be missing around mass shootings, and what the media seems to be missing, and what we aren't talking about, and that an increasing body of research seems to suggest is that many of these mass shootings, a disproportionate number of this gun violence is actually related to domestic violence. And that seems to be really clear as we get more research around this. There was a study done recently that found that 59% actually of mass shootings between 2014 and 2019 were domestic violence related in some form. That either the perpetrator was killing a family member, or the perpetrator had a history of domestic violence themselves. And in the context of these mass shootings, when domestic violence was involved in some capacity or other, there were actually more fatalities in those cases that were domestic violence related. So we seem to really be missing, or at least not having the conversation as much as we should, of the role of domestic violence in the context of these mass shootings. And we oftentimes the media seems to frame it as it's a stranger or a workplace shooting, and domestic violence doesn't seem to be involved at all. So we need to be having that conversation. And as a domestic violence researcher for more than 30 years, we also need to be having the conversation of how guns play a role in intimate partner violence. We tend to focus on the physical aspects or the sexual aspects of domestic violence, or the emotional aspects, and really need to be having more clear conversations about the roles of guns in this. And this was a national study actually done that found that some of the common forms of firearms, threatening to shoot the victim or displaying the weapon in a menacing way, as a part of domestic violence, as a part of that pattern of fear and coercive control. But another conversation that we aren't having, and we don't seem to be having enough, is the role of race and how disproportionately African American women are impacted by this gun violence. And this study further found that it was with non-fatal firearm use in the context of domestic violence that a disproportionate number of these survivors were Black or African American women. They were divorced or separated, had household incomes of less than $35,000 a year, had high school education or less, and lived in the southern region of the United States. So we know that the most marginalized women are at disproportionate likelihood of experiencing this gun violence in the context of their domestic violence. And it's not only non-fatal use of firearms during domestic violence, that Black women are actually killed in the context of domestic violence at disproportionate rates when compared to women of other ethnic backgrounds. So this report is published every year, When Men Murder Women, by the Violence Policy Center. And every year, the results are the same. that Black women are disproportionately more likely to be killed in the context of intimate relationships with a gun, actually 3 times higher rates than white women. And although Black women account for only 14% of the female population, they were disproportionately more likely to be killed by males in a single incident episode than women of other ethnic backgrounds. So we have to have conversations about racial disproportionality here. And we know the context of this gun violence. Oftentimes it happens, the gun violence is committed by an intimate partner. It's committed with a handgun, and it occurs during the course of an argument. And the Huffington Post did a story several years ago called "The Quiet Crisis Killing Black Women." But no, it really isn't a quiet. It's only a quiet crisis because we aren't giving our attention to it. And it's a conversation that is well overdue that we need to be having. So domestic violence, we tend to again focus on the mass shootings or police-involved violence against African American men, all worthy topics. But we also need to be talking about this type of violence, this type of gun violence as well, that's disproportionately impacting Black women. And so not only are Black women getting killed with guns by their intimate partners, they're also becoming survivor defendants because there is so much severe, serious, injurious violence directed toward them. They're also feeling as if they need to defend themselves from perpetrators, and they're using guns in self-defense. And one case that got a lot of attention was a case of Marissa Alexander, who fired off a warning shot against her abusive partner. There were 2 children present at the time, but he had severely assaulted her, severely assaulted the mothers of his other previous children, and she felt like she had to use violence, particularly a gun, to defend herself, and was then facing 20 years in prison as a result of firing that weapon. So we need to also look at it from that end of the perspective as well, if we're going to look at gun violence. And so here are some solutions to sort of get us started as we have this conversation. Is we need more research on gun violence and gun ownership of Black women. And we're starting to get that research now. A recent study just came out this year. And we know that actually Black women maybe are somewhat reluctant to even own firearms, but increasing number are purchasing them. So we need to understand why they're making these purchases. Some of it seems to be for self-protection and concerned about personal protection within their homes and within their communities. So understanding the motivations and the strategies for using these weapons is going to be crucial if we want to understand the role that gun ownership plays in the lives of Black women. We also need to, I believe, start having conversations to help survivor defendants in the court system. One thing I do with my research is I typically get calls from lawyers. This is a picture with myself and Kathy Gormley. She called me. Her client had actually shot her boyfriend 6 times in the back as he was fleeing. And there had been a long history of domestic violence. So it was an opportunity to go into the court system to write a report explaining the unique dynamics that Black women face when they're in domestic violence situations and why she felt the need to shoot him as he was fleeing. And we also brought in another expert to have a conversation about why would she continue to shoot after he was running away from her. And so some of the dynamics there. So reading the transcripts from the Renton Police Department, which is outside of Seattle, the officer is saying, well, how many times did you shoot? And she was crying and said, I don't know, maybe at least 2 times. And actually was a total of, she emptied the clip. And then, okay, then what happened next? You know, I pointed the gun again. I guess I couldn't stop. I couldn't stop. I looked down at the gun and it just kept making a clicking sound, and the gun didn't fire anymore. So understanding the psychological dynamics behind this, explaining it to judges and jury members to help them understand how gun violence plays a role in the trauma that Black women have experienced, is a critical part of the expert witness work that I am doing these days. Also, another solution or another part of what we need to be doing is when we do danger assessments to understand the risks that Black women and all survivors of intimate partner violence face, that we know a very clear pattern of what places survivors at risk for being victims of homicide. And Jackie Campbell's danger assessment is a way of understanding that. Clear things that we need to be asking about is, does that perpetrator have a gun? Have they ever threatened you with that weapon or a gun or another weapon in the context of stalking, sexual violence, drug use, but also having conversations about the roles of guns in danger assessments, because that not only puts the survivor at risk for being murdered, but it also puts the survivor at risk when a gun is involved for murdering a potential abusive partner. And finally, we need to have more conversations about just taking gun violence seriously against women, and particularly women of color. I remember writing an op-ed after the shooting of Megan Thee Stallion, the rapper, and she actually was shot by a person she had a relationship with, and he shot her in the foot. And working with the other psychologists, write op-eds to explain, why don't we take this violence against Black women seriously? What are the implicit biases and stereotypes of who they are? That means that even when they're shot, she had to actually show pictures of her injuries and actually get on Twitter and social media and say, look, this was very traumatic for me, and that this was a serious crime. I was a victim of this. This was not something that should have been joked about. But despite that, despite her serious injuries and having to go to court and testify, there were jokes and endless things on social media where she was accused of making this up, or that it was a hoax, or even that she was transgender and not a cisgender woman, and somehow she deserved to be shot. So part of the work that we need to do going forward is to really start to have critical conversations about this, and taking gun violence against Black women and women of color and all marginalized women much more seriously than we have, and making the invisible more visible. So I'm really delighted that we're having this conversation, and I look forward to seeing the comments from the other participants.
Thank you very much, Dr. West. I should have mentioned that Dr. West was sharing her perspective as a clinical psychologist whose work focuses on the experience of gender-based violence in the life of African American women. So thank you very much for those really insightful and poignant remarks, and for helping us understand and frame this discussion. Next, we're going to have Dr. Noelle St. Bill. As I mentioned, Dr. St. Bill is from the University of Buffalo School of Social Work, and her work explores Black male-female relationships, including the impact of structural racism on these relationships. Dr. St. Bill.
Thank you for that introduction. I want to start with statistics, some of these that Dr. West already captured, but I think it's important to repeat so that we don't forget and we realize the statistics that we are up against. And so compared to white women, Black women are 3 times more likely to be fatally shot by an intimate partner. Younger Black women, ages 18 to 34, are at greatest risk. They are 5 times as likely to be shot and killed by an intimate partner than white women. And while pregnant or postpartum, Black women face substantially higher rates of being killed than white or Hispanic women. And so in the brief 10 minutes that I was given today, I seek to contextualize intimate partner violence homicide statistics in the Black community by summarizing the issues that increase intimate partner violence risk and that act as barriers to seeking formal intimate partner violence services among Black people in this country. And so it's important to start with systematic racialized oppression, because this is key to understanding the disproportionate intimate partner violence gun homicide statistics in the Black community. We look at policies and practices that are designed to marginalize and oppress Black people, families, and relationships. Policies and practices create disproportionate statistics among Black people. For example, the enslavement of Black people and unjust American social policies have had adverse impact on Black relationships. We have to recognize that it's by design that we see higher rates of single mother-headed households among Black people. We got to recognize that it's by design that we have higher rates of mass incarceration, and that it is by design that Black men are put in positions that make it difficult for them to be breadwinners, protectors, and providers, and that it is by design that Black women historically have had to take on breadwinner roles and become protectors and providers in our community. It is by design this country has marginalized and oppressed Black people, and then we're expected to utilize the same system to intervene and change the very disproportionate statistics that in a sense was created for us. We are expected to utilize a system to change our plight, yet we fail to recognize that this is the same system that is doing exactly what it was designed to do, to marginalize and oppress. When we interact with these systems, we are often stigmatized for the oppression that is inflicted upon us. It is by design that we see higher numbers of Black people in poverty compared to other racial groups. And when it comes to intimate partner violence, we know that the risk of intimate partner violence increases, as Dr. West said, when living in low-income environments. We know that by design, low-income communities have higher levels of perceived violence, exposure to violence, and or worry about violence. We know that by design, low-income communities are exposed to more risk factors that are associated with intimate partner violence, such as child abuse, substance abuse and dependence, depression, and poor coping skills. And it is by design that there are more Black people living in urban environments than other racial groups, which are noted to have higher rates of violence, including intimate partner violence. When living in communities designed to have higher levels of violence, because that's what happens when you oppress people and you strip them of resources and you put them on the margins of society, it results in being more likely to be socialized to resolve issues with violence, even in intimate relationships. And so once we understand that the very statistics of intimate partner violence in the Black community is by design, the answer to the question of why Black people don't use formal resources at higher rates becomes clear. As Black people, we understand that these services were not created for us or with us in mind. When we look at the underutilization of intimate partner violence services in Black communities, the first thing that is evident is the lack of access to resources within the Black community. When we look at research, it points to a positive relationship between the percentage of white, non-Hispanic residents in a geographic area and comprehensive intimate partner violence screenings. On the other hand, research points to a negative association between neighborhoods with a high percentage of Black, non-Hispanic people and comprehensive intimate partner violence screening. So again, we see that the lack of access to services are by design, and it perpetuates the message that intimate partner violence services were not created with us in mind. If Black people want to obtain intimate partner violence services, we often have to do it at an inconvenience to us. We may have to go outside of our communities. We may have to secure transportation if we don't have a car. We may have to obtain childcare. We may have to miss work. We may have to forego other caregiving responsibilities in order to seek services outside of our community. Additionally, when considering whether to seek help or not, many of us are reminded of our mistrust of social institutions. We know that Black people in this country have a long legacy of mistreatment by social institutions, particularly the legal system. As a result, many Black people feel that police, lawyers, and judges do not care about them. Many survivors participating in my research are adamant that this is the case, based on their own experiences and the experiences of their loved ones. Statistics further supports this. In fact, we know that Black female victims and survivors of intimate partner violence are more likely to be arrested along with their abusers and have their children admitted to Child Protective Services if they call the police. We see that Black women are often denied services for failing to behave like the stereotypical intimate partner violence victim, not showing that they're meek or scared or weeping. And we are punished and we are penalized by the legal system for actively resisting our abusers. Another factor that dissuades some Black survivors of intimate partner violence from seeking help is the pretty high likelihood that when they do seek help, they will be met with culturally incompetent and culturally incongruent services. In other words, they will be met by service providers who may not understand their lived realities and worldviews. They will be met by service providers that deny instead of validate their oppression. They may be met by service providers who think intimate partner violence is the most pressing problem in their lives. They will be met by service providers who do not understand racial trauma. And they may be met by providers who do not understand the trauma that exists at the intersection of being Black and female. They will be met with providers who have a narrow focus of intimate partner violence and fail to understand how racism, sexism, poverty, substance abuse, chronic health conditions, and other traumas interact to shape their unique experiences. If they seek help, they know they might be met by intimate partner violence advocates that hold a white view of intimate partner violence, that only understand intimate partner violence through the lens of experiences of white middle-class women. They may come across providers that disregard spiritual and communal aspects in their intimate partner violence interventions, and they may disregard many things that Black people utilize in their healing process. If they decide to utilize these services, they know that the intricate details of their intimate relationships may be misunderstood. They know that they may come into contact with providers who are unaware of how slavery, legalized segregation and discrimination, and the guise of race-neutral policies have affected their intimate relationships. They may be unaware of how the role of historical trauma and current day trauma and how it affects them. They may miss internalized oppression and how I and others that look like me may have adapted to the oppression that was designed to break us and designed to destroy Black families and intimate relationships. We may come into contact with service providers who do not know how to use frameworks such as post-traumatic slave syndrome, developed by Dr. Joy DeGruy, as a lens for understanding dynamics that might be present in Black intimate relationships. They may not understand concepts such as vacant esteem and why I may feel that myself and my partner are unworthy of healthy intimate relationships in a system that was designed to exacerbate the demise of Black intimate relationships, Black families, and Black communities. And they may not understand why myself or my partner have ever-present anger or rage as an expression of frustration to marginalization, and how this ever-present anger and rage may manifest in intimate relationships that may result in my blaming my partner for systemic level issues that plague our relationship. They may not understand the role of racist socialization in my relationship, and how I have been socialized to adopt white norms and values, and how this desire for the white nuclear family may be causing a rift in my Black extended family structure. The barriers to utilizing formal intimate partner violence services are many, and it is by design that 40% or more of Black men and women have experienced intimate partner violence at some point in their lifetime. It is by design that Black women are disproportionately experiencing intimate partner violence, femicide, and gun violence by intimate partners at disproportionately high rates. And it is by design that we are locked out of services, that we cannot access services, and that we're presented with services that do not align with the realities of our lived experiences and worldviews. In the words of Audre Lorde, for the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. They will never enable us to bring about genuine change. In other words, seeking to dismantle intimate partner violence or the killing of Black women with guns by their loved ones cannot be done using the same systems, programs, policies, and interventions that was designed to oppress and marginalize the Black community. We must incorporate culturally specific and culturally appropriate and community-based solutions. We must understand what risk of intimate partner violence homicide looks like in the Black community. We must help the community recognize the red flags of intimate partner violence homicide. And we must seek to hear more from the voices of the Black community to inform our policies, practices, preventions, and interventions. I look forward to engaging in further dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. St. Bill. And thank you for providing that perspective. Next, we're going to have Professor Taubman Tyler talk about, first of all, I should say that Professor Taubman Tyler is from Brown University's Alpert School of Medicine, and her research focuses on a number of things, but particularly relevant today is her work on structural and legal determinants of health and health inequality, as well as public health law. I think Dr. St. Bill, it was a perfect connection from Dr. West's introduction to your work. So you can take it away, Professor Taubman Tyler.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. And it was really wonderful listening to both Dr. St. Vidal and Dr. West, and I think they covered a lot of important points that I will probably reinforce in some of my discussion. So I'm a lawyer by training, but I focus on the ways in which laws and policies affect health. And I have focused in a number of different papers and other work that I've done, focusing particularly on Black women, the effect both in terms of reproductive justice, as well as issues related to domestic violence and gun violence. So what I'd like to do is sort of talk about the intersection of firearm laws, of domestic violence and reproductive justice, and focus on kind of how those various things connect to one another, but also to talk a little bit about recent laws and policies that I think are very concerning, that are really building on and exacerbating problems that we already see with regard to violence against, particularly against Black women. So I'm going to start with statistics, and I know Dr. Saintville did the same thing, but I think I'll highlight some that she mentioned, but also some that have to do with reproductive justice. So the Sister Song, which is an organization that focuses on reproductive justice, and particularly as it relates to women of color, talks about essentially the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, have children, not have children, and parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. And so when we think about reproductive justice, we don't think about just people's choice with regard to reproductive care, but also safety in terms of parenting and essentially supporting people to have children and in a safe environment. And so I want to connect that to reproductive justice and then talk about some of the ways in which domestic violence and gun violence play into this. So in terms of statistics, Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die from pregnancy or during postpartum than they are to white women. They are disproportionately living now in states, particularly in the South, that have banned abortion. The very same states that have banned abortion have some of the worst policies with regard to a safety net or access to resources. So if you think about things like expansion of Medicaid, many of the states that have banned abortion, and particularly in the South, have not expanded Medicaid. They have incredibly restrictive eligibility for other supportive systems like TANF and SNAP, making parenting obviously extremely difficult for low-income women in particular. And many of those same states also have incredibly few restrictions on access to firearms. So all of those things sort of come together in different ways. And then when we think about domestic violence, pregnancies associated with both the initiation of domestic violence and an increase in the severity of domestic violence, making it a particularly difficult time. Black women are already experiencing higher rates of domestic violence and are 5 times more likely to be killed by an abusive partner during pregnancy, most often with a firearm. So that was mentioned earlier. Black women are more likely to experience police violence and to lose their children to gun violence. That causes significant trauma, obviously, and trauma itself has a significant effect on health, and I would say also particularly on maternal health. So again, sort of the connection between violence, between gun violence in particular, and some of the statistics around maternal health outcomes are connected to one another. Black women are also more likely to be incarcerated while, and in particular, while they're pregnant. They're more likely to be evicted from their homes. And they have children, as was mentioned earlier, often removed by Child Protective Services, what many people now are calling the family policing system. And that often is a result, particularly for lower income Black women in particular, based on lack of resources, low income, often associated with or determined to be neglect as opposed to support. And of course, because of biases about substance use, which we know from the research is significantly interpreted significantly different among Black women than it is white women, meaning that they often have their children removed, even though they use substances at a rate often less than other groups. So I want to sort of talk about policies and recent court decisions and the way in which they are actually exacerbating these horrific inequities that have existed for a long time. So of course, the Dobbs decision, Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health, which overturned Roe versus Wade, essentially is having a disproportionate effect on Black women, not only because it's removing reproductive choices, but exacerbating existing barriers to reproductive health care in states with large Black populations. So there are larger Black populations in states that have now limited access to reproductive care, as I've talked about. Studies also show that access to abortion is associated with a reduction in domestic violence. So obviously, if you think about the power dynamics that are often part of domestic violence or are part of domestic violence, the ability to make a decision to terminate a pregnancy plays an important role in the ability to control not only one's destiny, but also to get away from or to leave an abusive relationship that may continue. It's also likely that Black women are more vulnerable to gun-related homicide during pregnancy, because if they are unable to terminate a abusive relationship, then they're more likely to experience gun violence, as we talked about earlier. It's also likely to make maternal health outcomes worse, as for the underlying reasons for disparities in maternal mortality and morbidity. Stress is actually hugely important in the area of maternal mortality and morbidity, and as we know, the rates for Black women are significantly significantly higher than they are for other groups, and that's because we see a whole range of issues around discrimination and bias, and for access to quality health care. And then, of course, a whole range of social determinants of health that have to do with income, housing, employment, and all kinds of ways in which Black women are underrepresented or are discriminated against. On a positive note, I did want to mention the Momnibus Act, which has been promoted by Representative Lauren Underwood, as well as the Black Maternal Health Caucus in Congress, which is really focused on addressing the maternal health crisis, but doing so through multiple ways, including addressing issues around resources, around safety, really around addressing a range of different issues that I think could be helpful, not only around the maternal health crisis, but also around empowering and providing Black women better opportunities to escape relationships that are harmful, and particularly relationships or environmental places in which firearm violence is significant. And then I also wanted to mention the case New York Rifle versus Bruin, which was a case that essentially made it much more easy for states or state governments to allow gun access, or in other words, much harder for state government to restrict access to guns under the Second Amendment. And under that case, it made it vastly more difficult for states to not only restrict firearms, but also that means it makes it much easier for people to access guns and carry them in public. And as we know, understanding domestic violence, that obviously the more access someone has to firearms, the more likely they're going to use them. Certainly, if there is a firearm in the home, it's much more likely to be used in that setting. And interestingly, Justice Breyer, who dissented in the Bruin case, pointed out, that having a gun in the home makes it 5 times more likely that a victim is going to be killed by that firearm. And the Supreme Court in that case made it clear that really is not a consideration that's important, that they really focused on history and tradition and did not take into account what we know to be significant public health implications of access to firearms, and in particular for women of color. And then I think it's important to understand too that Black women whose abusive partners who have access to firearms, they're already resistant, and this was already talked about, to call law enforcement for a whole range of reasons. They don't trust that system because that system has not been supportive. And Dr. St. Bill laid that out really beautifully. So they fear for their own lives because law enforcement, as we know, in Black communities, often are violent themselves against individuals and families, and they may fear for their own safety. They may fear for the safety of their partner, who may be violent, but also is somebody that they care about. They're also concerned about child protective services because we know that the rate of removal of Black children is significantly higher than other groups. They're also worried about being evicted because we know that domestic calls to police based on domestic violence may often lead to landlords evicting them. And so we know from the research that Black women, particularly Black mothers, are more likely to be evicted. So I think Dr. St. Bill's discussion about all of the problems with the current systems and the racism involved in these systems, it makes this whole question much more complicated for Black women than for other groups. And so finally, I would say that when we think about sort of moving forward and recognizing the complexity of these issues, including reproductive justice issues, connecting to domestic violence, connecting to gun violence, we really have to think about how do we structure law and policy and system reform to address these root causes of disparities for Black women's health and safety. And I think, unfortunately, we're going in the opposite direction of where we need to be going, which is really undermining reproductive rights and justice, undermining firearm restrictions that keep all of us more safe, but particularly Black women who are exposed more to firearm violence. And ultimately, this is really about respecting the dignity of Black women to have reproductive choice, but ultimately to live in supportive and safe communities. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Finally, our last speaker, we have Attorney Tashawn Bowden-Lewis. Attorney Bowden-Lewis, as I mentioned earlier, is the Chief Public Defender for the state of Connecticut. She oversees the public defender's operations, but she has experience as a practitioner on both sides of the room and is here to share her insights from both of those. Thank you, Attorney Bowden-Lewis.
No, thank you. Thank you for allowing me to be on the panel. I have the pleasure of listening to my 3 other fellow panelists who have just given you all the information. All the stats have been given, all the information has been given. And so I'm going to round it out by just giving some more perspective on some things in the court system itself. But to start off, let me just say that the intersectionality of being both Black and being a woman creates obstacles that are very, very hard to overcome. That's something that we all know and are aware of, but when it comes to these issues for the panel today, talking about gun violence and domestic violence in particular, there's some of these things seem to be insurmountable. And the basis of that is because of this whole concept and perception that Black women are resilient. Our strength handicaps us because that perception makes law enforcement officers, the court systems, defense attorneys, and prosecutors believe negative things that affect us in very harsh ways. In Connecticut, all the stats that have been given to you all, they ring true right here. So though Black and brown women make up less of the population, female adult population here in Connecticut, Black women and brown women are those who are arrested more, criminalized more, are more severely punished in the realm of domestic violence specifically, and anything dealing with gun violence here in Connecticut. And it far trumps the arrests, the way cases are disposed of, and the handling of the actual person throughout the system than white women. The fact that here in Connecticut, though we are one of those states that have probably a lower amount of gun violence than other states do have, when it comes to gun suicides by race, Black people in general have the highest rate here in Connecticut. When it comes to homicides by guns, again, Black people have the highest rate of being affected here in Connecticut. So when it comes to Black women specifically, the reality is that when a Black woman is arrested in this state for domestic violence charges, or actually, let's go back, when a Black woman actually calls police regarding domestic violence and incapacity, the fear and reality of being arrested as well too, that's a hindrance right there. So that, number one, even if there's something that's going on that's legally against the law, the fact that many Black women are not going to call the police in the first place, because why would I end up being arrested, losing a time from work, losing my home, having my child be taken away? Those are real realities that have to be thought about and maneuvered in the system that other women and other genders and ethnic groups want to deal with. Once the Black woman is actually arrested, again, the process, and I'm speaking in generally, I mean, that fact that the majority of Black women in the state, this is what it is. It's going to be a longer process, a harsher process, and parity does not seem to always fit into the equation, unfortunately. And so when you think of those realities, you have to think about the fact that where are the solutions? What are the ways we can try to change these things? And the most obvious, but though probably the one that's not going to necessarily have the most impact, is education. The judges, the police officers, the prosecutors, and the defense attorneys need to be educated about what is going on, including their own confirmation bias that they have regarding Black women and other women of color when it comes to these kinds of cases. There was a bill that had been proposed recently in the House here in Connecticut that was going to be affecting those who are charged with domestic violence cases. The possibility was going to be, that was proposed originally, was to actually have the penalty be for a murder charge to be life without parole. So how is that going to affect a lot of people for domestic violence situations? That's going to have a devastating effect. Thank goodness that language was removed and there was something else substituted in its place, but that would have been the impact of that, if it had gone forward, would have been devastating. The educational component of the solution. I said originally that though it was the best way to go, it may not have the most impact because, people are people, the humanity of us are all. We are going to believe, we're going to believe, even if we are given information, stats, facts about what it is and how things really are. Some people are still not going to have that buy-in when it comes to that. And it's going to affect those of color more so than anybody else. The reality here in Connecticut is that the majority of people in the system are Black and brown. There has been an uptick in gun ownership for women, Black women specifically, in Connecticut, because there's a need. There's the fear. Who else is going to protect us? The majority of the men, the Black men, are not around based on incarceration or other situations that are going on. So yes, there has been a huge rise in gun ownership for Black women in the state. And the reality of having a partner put in jail or in prison for a period of time goes back to what we just talked about. The disruption of the home. Contrary to belief, there are many Black men who are fathers and who are husbands, legal husbands, and who are committed to their families and trying to do the best that they can for their families. So when an arrest is made, just because a neighbor hears voices being raised, that disrupts the household. The money that comes in, the stability of having protection, a father in the home, those things happen all the time. It's important for all of us to understand that the reality of race, the reality of race coupled with gender, puts Black women at the lowest part of the totem pole. And there needs to be ways to actually educate more people in positions of authority to try to understand the humanity and not just look at the fact that this person, whether the person is a survivor or whether the person is someone who's a perpetrator, who's actually killed someone because of some sort of domestic violence situation, that parity is important when you treat how you treat the person, how the cases are disposed of, what happens, the longevity of the case in the system, and all the collateral consequences that come along with that. So just remembering that here in this state of Connecticut, there's a stark contrast when it comes to domestic violence arrests, when it comes to gun ownership, and for the Black woman, it's a negative situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Attorney Bowden-Lewis, for providing the perspective from the court system and sharing some light on the case of the state of Connecticut. I appreciate that. And it was, I think, a great way to round out our conversation. We are going to open it up to questions. And while I said I was going to get us started, I'm going to take that back because we have some questions in the chat and I want to make sure we get those in first. One question, and I know Dr. West has jumped in on the chat, but I don't know if we want to share this in the broader discussion. An audience member asked, are there any known tools or work on tools that include race as a factor in lethality as well? I know Dr. West has put a link to the something from dangerousassessment.org. I don't know if that is specifically your work as a psychologist, but I'm wondering if we have those assessments as well in the court system, in service provisions. So any of the panelists can jump in here.
Yeah, I did put a link in there. Jackie Campbell is a nurse by training. She developed the danger assessment. And more recently, she has a danger assessment that considers violence among immigrant populations and some of the unique challenges there. I'm not aware of any others that formal sort of assessments that consider race, but that's certainly something that we have to consider because Black women are at risk for not only being more likely to be murdered by intimate partners, they're at risk for higher rates of strangulation, which is an item on the danger assessment. And they're also at risk for higher rates of what we call reproductive coercion. So violence that occurred that where the perpetrator is trying to control the reproductive capacity of the victim. So not allowing them to use birth control or pressuring them to terminate a pregnancy when that may not be their choice. So I'm really happy that Liz talked about some of that in her talk because not only are Black women more likely to be killed, but pregnant Black women or those who have shortly given birth, within a year of giving birth, are even at higher rates of fatalities. So we have to be talking about the unique intersection of race, and it's really racism that puts them at risk, not race per se, but what comes with race that increases the risk. So we have to look at, we can't take a colorblind approach to this.
I was gonna chime in if I can in terms of reproductive cohesion. I was gonna say I love the work of Dr. Kamala Alexander. She's at Johns Hopkins University School of Nursing. So that'd be good to check out. With regards to lethality assessments and race, like Dr. West said, besides the dangerous assessment and how it's been revamped and made relevant for immigrant women. I haven't seen anything else specifically for Black women, but I know Dr. Tricia McGoodley has been doing work around trying to understand more about what domestic violence homicide looks like in the Black community. And so how does the Black community talk about domestic violence homicide? What do they say are some of the red flags for domestic violence homicide? And so she did, I think, something about 22, 23 focus groups with women, had over 120, I think close to 130 participants, and kind of getting that feedback and some of the red flags that she got in her focus groups. Can't remember exactly what they were that were missing from the danger assessment. And so she makes recommendations with regards to how to build on that. I'm not sure if her article is out yet. I know it was in press, so if it's not out yet, it should be coming out soon.
I would just add, I've spent a lot of my career working with healthcare providers, and I think, thinking about how to do safety assessment for anyone who's experiencing domestic violence. But again, some of the challenges, particularly for women of color and particularly for Black women, is trusting healthcare providers to actually be supportive in situations where they're experiencing domestic violence and potentially gun violence or homicide. And I think it's really critical, again, thinking about system reform or education to help healthcare providers to think about the most productive ways to work with for women of color. And part of that is having a healthcare system that engages and brings in people who are culturally sensitive and also, look like the patients that they're serving. And so I think, again, all of these questions around the connection between race, experience of domestic violence, health, we have to be understanding that we can't just sort of keep doing things the way that we do them generally across populations. We really need to be thinking about how we do this effectively and bring in the voices of people from the Black community in particular about the best way to approach the problem.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, I'll ask my question, which is just sort of a big one, but there's, Attorney Bowden Lewis at one point in your remarks asked, how do we change things? here, right? And I think that there's, clearly there's a larger systemic structural change that needs to happen. And we can certainly get to that in the conversation, but in the short term, while we work and pursue those sorts of structural changes, and I'm thinking about this especially in the context of a changing policy environment where firearms are becoming more permissive, and other avenues to protect women's health are becoming more restrictive. Are there other policy areas? Are there other tools, whether those be in the healthcare system, in the courts, in our social networks, that some states are using or that we might think about using as ways to better protect and support Black and Brown women as they navigate this difficult space?
I can say for the court system, and even for my own, as the chief for the state of Connecticut, one of the first things, and one of the biggest priorities for me is recruitment and retention. So being able to hire more diverse people, specifically of color, is huge. Again, as I said, in Connecticut, the majority of people in the system are Black and Brown. And so, yes, being able to hire people in positions of authority and power, and just to hire them, period. New young talent coming in, whether they're a social worker, an investigator, an attorney, clerical staff person, which is the first person people meet and were greeted by when they come into the door. That's important. As they say, representation matters. It's true. But it's also about the cultural perspective, being able to understand certain things and be able to assist other people to understand certain things as well, too. And that only does not apply for my own agency, but in the court system, hiring more diverse judges, more diverse prosecutors, because we need fair prosecutors who are of color as well, too. So that goes throughout the entire criminal justice system, hiring people, qualified people, obviously, but hiring people of color, Black people, to be in these positions to assist in changing the dynamic and shifting the culture.
I would also respond to that is maybe not an over-reliance on the criminal legal system either. I mean, intimate partner violence really is a public health and social problem in many ways. So relying on a criminal legal system to fix this seems ill-advised. So I work with a group in the YWCA here in Seattle. We have a program called Survivors First, and we target particularly women of color who have used violence, for example, in self-defense, to see what kinds of services we can offer them. Maybe they need housing, maybe they need something else rather than certainly being arrested to deal with the violence in their lives. So thinking broader about how we approach this problem would be even more impactful, I think.
I do agree with you, Dr. West. I mean, especially when it comes to the arrest in and of itself, there's such a thing called police discretion, so that if there isn't any kind of situation where there is an overt violence that's actually happening, the bruises are on either person, being able to say, okay, yeah, people do have escalated voices or higher increased voices in arguments. I see that, I understand things are fine, hands off, or you're having a social worker come as opposed to a police officer in a time of crisis to come to mediate and mitigate situations. So I do agree with you. Before they get to me, being able to even stop that before it comes my way. So I totally agree.
Also thinking about more community-based interventions, I think about a lot of the how do you address gun violence, right? And especially the gun violence among our young Black youth, and have seen things like as credible messengers, right? And so what would that look like in terms of domestic violence? What would that look like to have quote unquote credible messengers or people in the community who are going out, who are trained, equipped, experienced in doing this work? And so I think that's another part that we need to really think about is these community level interventions, community bystander interventions as well. And then thinking about how the legal system can really support our communities and community interventions opposed to the other way around.
Mhm. I just wanted to also acknowledge my colleague here, Bridget, who's a legal navigator for the Survivors First program, and maybe she would also like to lend her voice to this in terms of what she's seeing as other ways being hands-on with what we can do as well.
Sure, Bridget, do you want to share?
Oh, sure. Good morning. That's Bridget Griffin, and I'm with the YWCA, and we do have the program. Actually, Doris O'Neill is the one who is her brainchild, and she started this program, and seeing survivors in the system, mainly Black women, women of color, who were falling through the cracks. They were being arrested, they were going to jail. Majority of them are fighting back. A lot of them was dealing with being strangled. And so our program, we developed a partnership with the prosecutor's office, King County's prosecutor's office. There's a dedicated prosecutor in that office who looks for these cases that come across that they see that is potentially that the true victim is being prosecuted. So what they do is they take a deeper look into it, that case, and they look at the background, the history, and it's not just DV cases. They also look at DUIs. They look at thefts. There's often times where survivors are being denied financially, not allowed what they need. And so sometimes we've had survivors being arrested because they were stealing diapers and milk because the abuser would not give them money or provide them with anything. So we were able to catch some of those cases and refer them. And so we meet those survivors where they're at, whatever their needs are, we meet them. But we work to have those cases either dismissed or declined. And so that's one way that the cases get to us. I have a lot of direct referrals for survivors that come to me and they're dealing with it. And so I'm able to work and get this into bring it to the awareness of the prosecutor that, we do a victim statement with them to show that this is actually the victim. And so we had a lot of cases dismissed. We are working to expand the program. Actually, Doris and Dave Martin, he is the chair over the DV program, the head of the DV program for the King County Prosecutor's Office. So they went to DC last week and presented this program and was talking to him. So she went also to San Diego, I think last year. And so the word is getting out about the program. And so we're really hoping to expand this program to get to other municipalities, especially places where there is a high population of African-American women of color, and to bring to the attention that they're being prosecuted and they're being, the balance of how they're treated in the legal system is off. And so the success rate is really good. And we're seeing a lot of prosecutors. There are specific ones that are like, they're getting it. They're calling me. I had a prosecutor call me the other day, say, I think this is a victim. So to have a prosecutor call me, versus saying, I'm going to convict them, I don't care, it's working. And so that's kind of our program.
Thank
what
you,
we're doing
Bridget.
here in Seattle. Yes.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. We really appreciate it.
You're
Next,
welcome.
I see a hand up, Dr. Zioli.
Hi. First, I just want to thank you all so much. This has been really illuminating, and my question is going to sound jumbled because there are so many thoughts going around in my head that have come from what you've said. So thank you for that. But my research looks at legal firearm restrictions for perpetrators of domestic violence. And I've looked at the effect of these firearm restrictions on intimate partner homicide in the white population and intimate partner homicide in the Black population, and found that they're protective in the white population, but don't seem to make a difference in the Black population. And one that particularly surprised me was laws saying that if you're convicted of misdemeanor violence, you can't purchase or possess a gun. And that, was non-significant in the Black population. And the reason it surprised me was because of overcriminalization of, Black men. And I thought that that might end up, a consequence of overcriminalization might have been a protective effect. Yeah, and I'm just thinking about what Dr. St. Bill said about, the stressors of all of that and how that can play a role in intimate partner violence. And so I'm wondering really about how do we protect Black women from gun violence if, this legal system approach doesn't seem to be working, for them, because the legal system approach is the only way to legally remove a firearm. If, somebody tries to remove a firearm and it, themselves, they could be charged with theft. So you mentioned credible messengers and other things, but I'm interested to hear what your other thoughts are.
That's a tough one. And I'll be honest, it really is. I'm thinking about it, trying to gather my thoughts. Is the reality is things are just so stacked against. And it's sad to say that even in my position, I don't even have a real answer for you. And that does sadden me. Because as a Black woman myself, anything could happen. You know what I mean? Even to me, it doesn't matter about titles and degrees. I'm still a Black woman, and I walk around in the streets and I see things. I honestly don't know, and I'm going to think about it some more. But maybe the doctors may have something, but I don't know.
I think for me, I kind of go back to my earlier comment just around community-based interventions and working more with the community, hearing from the community's experiences of what will and what won't work with regards to gun violence. How do we stop it in our community? How do we address it in our communities? How do we change the conversation around it? How do we hold each other accountable within the community? And so I think it really goes back to really starting with and where the community is and trying to build upon that. Again, likewise, don't, have the answers for, what it should look like, but I strongly believe that interventions, prevention, it's got to come from the community.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm familiar with some of your work, and I appreciate the work and the nuances there and how you're trying to unpack that. As a psychologist, looking at stereotypes and biases and images of Black women, I did put in the chat a documentary that we just finished called Subjects of Desire, that's screening on Stars and Hulu now, where we did a deep dive in those stereotypes and how they really put Black women at risk for all forms of intimate partner violence and violence in the larger population. I just keep going back to the case with Megan Thee Stallion. And part of the reason even though she was shot, initially wasn't candid with the police about who shot her and why, is because she was afraid when the police showed up. And then here it is, even though they're wealthy Black people, but they got guns and were afraid that they would experience gun violence from the police. So you're reluctant to even talk about the violence when you are a victim and to involve law enforcement. So it's really a dilemma in terms of what we have, how we kind of unpack all of this. But looking at all the intersections would be critical of why they're at more risk for gun violence and why they aren't willing to use the legal system to address that. So acknowledging that history of racism and all of those things that intersect with all of that.
I think Carolyn's point is really important. And to sort of add to that, I think if for laws that that involve charges, somebody being convicted of a misdemeanor or having a restraining order and then having their firearms removed theoretically based on either of those, and you're talking about misdemeanors, that ultimately a lot of the burden for that falls on the victim or survivor, because we know that oftentimes even if a person subject to a restraining order or someone who's been convicted of a misdemeanor is supposed to relinquish their guns, that doesn't happen. And my guess is that, and again, this is speculation, but for Black women, that may require them to trust the system, to be engaged in the process of making sure that happens, because often the enforcement of those laws does not happen. And so I would suspect it kind of comes back to the things we've been talking about, which is, do those systems really work for Black women in the same way that they do for white women? And they're hard enough as they are for, I think, for any victim or survivor to actually make sure that they're enforced.
Thank you all. Thank you for that question, and thank you for those really thoughtful answers. Are there any additional questions from the audience? I don't see anything, but I'll throw out one. I'm not sure. It's not really a well-formed question. I'm gonna echo April's thoughts or comment that there are so many things that I'm thinking about, and one of the things I'm thinking about is the many spillover effects that have been highlighted in this conversation in terms of Black women not only bearing a disproportionate burden from the intersection of gun violence and domestic violence, but then the disproportionate burden their communities bear when they are in the way it impacts their children, their friends, their family members. And so what sorts of mechanisms, I guess, can we pursue as again, the legal, Attorney Bowden Lewis has, left us all equally stumped with the what other systems do we have, do Black women have available to them when the justice system is often not just. So I'm sort of rambling here, but I'm wondering how, again, while we unpack this and address the structural issues, how states are supporting communities, and if there are some states or some areas that are doing this better than other in terms of providing some insulation, if we can, on the impact that trauma has on their whole family and community.
I'll just say that I'm not quite sure how far advanced it is here in Connecticut, but the going back to the training and education of like service providers, and law enforcement, I think is key. Because even if you go to a service provider, if you go to some sort of a safe haven type of a situation, if you're a domestic violence survivor, stereotypes are going to be right there for that too. So how a person is handled in the system, whether it be the criminal justice part of it, or even just the assistance and resources that are provided, there's a very big divide for Black women, even going in for those situations. So I firmly believe that the educational component, the training for all the steps, whether it's the legal part of it or the resource part of it, has to be there, because Black women are affected. We're affected by those things because there's that resilience aspect of things. Oh, she's strong. She doesn't really need mental health support. She doesn't really need someone to come in and assist with parenting skills. She's got it, with the same things that happen with Black maternal health. That concept that is pervasive, but is destroying us.
We just need teams and teams of mental health providers in these communities that are being deeply impacted by gun violence, because there is so much post-traumatic stress. It's not even post-traumatic because it's ongoing. Stress disorder out there that's impacting children, families, and it's not just the homicides and the loss of life, but the severe injuries and just the constant exposure to gun violence that is having, just decimating the mental health of communities of color, and that's going to have to be addressed.
I would just add, we know with domestic violence that a survivor is only going to be able to protect themselves and potentially put themselves in a position of getting out of a relationship where their life or safety is in jeopardy if they have the resources to do that. And I think, we know that there's huge inequities in terms of access to resources, whether it's, being able to have housing or employment or, healthcare that's supported, any of those kinds of resources that are vital, really to any survivor, but Black women disproportionately don't have access to those things that ultimately provide them a sense of power or choice about what they're able to do. And then, of course, all of the things we've talked about with law enforcement and the criminal justice system, which are not working. But I think it's really important to think about the disproportionality of resources. And that comes back to the sort of stereotype of resilience, right? Like, you're supposed to be able to just do this when in fact you don't have the tools and the supports to be able to make those decisions and to act on them.
Thank you. I will give one last call. We are just about at time. Okay. Attorney Bowden Lewis, Dr. St. Bill, Dr. Taubman Tyler, Dr. West, thank you all so much for your thoughtful, insightful comments and your conversation today. It has certainly been enlightening for me and made us all think so much, not just about the disproportionate burden women and specifically Black women play, but the intersection between domestic violence and all types of gun violence, whether that be mass shooting, suicide, homicide, and community violence. Black women are certainly carrying the burden here. And I appreciate you sharing that all with us. Thank you all to our audience participants. We're glad you're here. And I want to remind you that the fourth and final series in this year's webinar is on May 24th. It will be implementing domestic violence gun laws. So thank you all and have a good afternoon.